soldiers with their state medals, and the sergeant Inna Derusova was killed during an artillery bombardment while she was providing first aid for the wounded in Akhtirka in Sumy Oblast, and she became the first woman to be awarded the Hero of Ukraine status posthumously. And today, the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the United States organized this roundtable to discuss women's experiences of war and women's activism in contemporary Ukraine. In addition, panelists will examine how women in the international community can provide assistance for Ukrainians to help them fight and win in this war. My name is Olena Nikolayenko. I'm professor of political science at Fordham University in New York City, and the chair of the communications committee at the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the United States. And it's a great pleasure and honor for me to introduce participants in our today's roundtable. I will just say a few words about each of them, and then they will have an opportunity to provide their perspective on the situation in Ukraine. Afterwards, I will moderate the Q&A session, so you will be able to post your questions in the Q&A, and we'll proceed from there. So just today we have the following panelists. Olga Boichak is a lecturer in digital cultures at the Department of Media and Communications, University of Sydney. She is a sociologist with expertise in computational social science, and her research interests span networks, narratives, and cultures of activism in the digital age. Before joining the University of Sydney in 2019, Dr. Boichak was a visiting scholar at Rice University in Canada and a research assistant at the Center for Computational and Data Sciences at Syracuse University in the United States, where she contributed to the development of tools, analytic techniques that support social listening, bot detection, information literacy, and decision-making in complex scenarios. Christina Olha Jarymowycz is a scholar with research interests in gender and agency, transnational feminism, gendered embodiment, and post-socialism. She holds a doctorate in sociology from Boston University and a master's degree in regional studies, Russia, Eastern Europe, and Central Asia from Harvard University. Currently, Dr. Jarymowycz is working as a researcher at Harvard Business School, where she studies investors and companies that seek to generate a social benefit alongside financial profit. Tamara Martsenyuk is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Ukraine. And she was a Fulbright scholar at the Harriman Institute at Columbia University in 2017-2018. Her research interests include gender and social structure, among them women's access to the military. In 2021, Dr. Martsenyuk, with her research team, conducted a research project titled Invisible Battalion 3.0 Sexual Harassment in the Military. And we hope that also Jessica Zakhovic would be able to join us in a few minutes. She's the director of Fulbright and Institute of International Education Kyiv office. She recently published her monograph, Superfluous Women, Art, Feminism and Revolution in 21st Century Ukraine with the University of Toronto Press. In 2017-2018, Dr. Zakhovic was a US Fulbright scholar at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, where she taught courses in visual sociology, gender, and conducted interviews and archival research toward her second book. So let me welcome all the panelists and all the participants who joined us today to discuss women's experiences of war and women's activism in Ukraine. Our first speaker will be Tamara Martsenyuk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for organizing this event, and it will be my actually first experience of talking about this war in Ukraine. And it's very interesting that actually before I did research on gender relations, women's participation in Euromaidan, and then in Donbass. And as Olena mentioned, we did a number of studies on women's access to military profession and on women's veterans, sexual harassment. And currently we were working on the project on women's access to military education. And then very suddenly and unexpectedly war happened. I was in Kyiv, and in Kyiv woke up from explosion and couldn't understand what is going on. And I stayed in my apartment in Kyiv. It's Borshchagivka district. It's actually northern west of Kyiv for around I think 8 days. And after that I was forced to evacuate first to Western Ukraine and then abroad. And I would like to maybe to talk on women's participation in this war through my personal experience, my ethnography, so-called, because first of all, and also through analytical sociological perspective, as we could guess, women as those who face the war, they could be very often mainly portrayed as victims of war, those who suffer from violence, those who evacuate, but at the same time, and it's I want to have this bridge to connection to Euromaidan events. Also, I think that Euromaidan events and later Donbass showed that women are not only victims of military actions of war, but also agents. And before the war, actually, women constitute around 10%, I think, approximately, of military force in Ukraine, and they managed to get access to combat positions in military, and also in military. Actually, all military institutions were opened for women in theory, but of course in practice there were some problems, and even now from time to time, so we could see that women participate as military also in Kyiv, as in other large cities. There is this territorial self-defense where people can come as volunteer to join this defense. It's mainly combat defense, and it's not so easy to get access because there are lines, and women, they also want to join. And I was very actively following Facebook group of my Borshchagivka district of Kyiv, and could see a number of times where some women were writing to ask if it's possible for them also to join self-organized defense of this district. It's actually a very grassroots unit where people who mainly have cars, because who have cars, so they may have some time and energy, and they want to self-organize to do patrolling and also to help vulnerable groups of population, those who have small kids, also elderly, and people with disabilities. And it was quite clear that actually, and I saw when during daytime I was walking around near my apartment building, it was visible that in these groups there were mainly men, but also women who were checking some objects, walking around near places where people, for example, were buying some supplies or medicine. In my, I live in an apartment building that is quite old, I would say, built in 80s. And there are a lot of elderly people there, especially elderly women. And of course, they couldn't actually, I would say, not majority, but probably half of these women, they stayed and they couldn't move. And in my apartment building, where there are a lot of small apartments, it's so people they also organize self-patrolling during night shifts and daytime, and there were also women who did it. Of course, majority men, but we could see there are some women, and women were among those who were helping this elderly women, for example, to put tapes on glass on windows, yes, to protect windows from explosion. And also one of the challenge during wartime is a daily routine and supplies, lack of food, especially fresh bread. And in my building, there were some advertisements that there are elderly women who bake bread, and if you need, so you could come and take. So it was this small self-organization also of some food supply. In Kyiv, you could see actually that it was also organized in a grassroots way, where restaurants they helped with food, and women were also, I would say, quite actively involved. As for another challenge is also to get some medicine, and I personally, first time in my life, experienced the problems with heart and with medicine to calm down the heart. And my neighbor, she actually gave this medicine, but of course it was shorted, and in drugstores it was even after long line. Once I was standing like almost more than 2 hours, it was difficult to get, because especially older people, they use this calm down medicine. But as for me, I think it was very important to see that neighbors, they organized, and usually, you know, when you live in a huge city, it's quite anonymous. You don't know your neighbors in a huge apartment building. But it was, I would say, vice versa, and the neighbors, they were caring to somehow to each other, especially women. Like my neighbor, whose doors in front of mine, she also gave us some, like she got some food like potatoes and this jar with tomatoes. So she was she tried to take care on this very daily basis level. And when we with my friend and colleague with whom we stayed together in this apartment, so when we decided to evacuate, of course we informed her and told that we do this. And another challenge, of course, it's organized shelter, to get to the shelter and organize it. Subway stations were actively used, but for example, from my apartment, it's quite far. And in our apartment building, this underground space was in a very bad condition. So we were supposed to hide in a bathroom tub, and we spent quite a lot of time during sirens and bombings. We could hear bombing because actually this district is close to Bucha and Irpin, and there were heavy fights in Bucha and Irpin. And actually, because of this, we somehow decided that we need to evacuate from Kyiv. It was really hard decision, and one of the challenge that you face, especially when you are a woman, is that very often women, but also men, they worry about you, and they sometimes say in a very strict order that you are not in defense, so you are civilian who restricts military, so you should evacuate immediately. And I received some of such very direct messages from my male friends, and was upset because, you know, sometimes, like, if you don't have car, you don't drive, it was very difficult to evacuate. And there are different groups of women, and of course women with kids are very vulnerable group, elderly women, women with some disabilities, and they are priority also for train evacuation. So with my colleague, we were waiting also not to take, you know, place of this vulnerable groups of women, because it's, you know, when you storm, when you probably saw pictures how evacuations through trains was, and there were a lot of people, and sometimes in some coupe there were around 19 people. For example, train from Kharkiv, this coupe, this space is for 4, but there were 19 people. So it's and that is why we were waiting. And another challenge is how you get if you don't have car, and if you are not priority, because for volunteers, priority were vulnerable groups of women. So how to get to railway station? So there were a number of challenges, and sometimes, you know, people who are not in this Kyiv or other cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol, they may not understand the whole, I don't know, the whole danger of the situation. But what I was also very positively actually impressed then when I decided to go abroad, because actually I was very difficult to sleep, and because of the sirens and bombing, and it looks like there were, you know, when you understand that you started to have some psychological problems, nightmares because of this noise, and so I decided to go abroad, not to here, because even in Western Ukraine, and I firstly came to my home city in Volhynia area, Koval, but Belarus is very close, and there is always danger that there could be something through Belarus border. And of course, majority of people who are evacuating women with kids. And for some women, it may be first experience in general to travel without men, especially abroad. So they may not know language. They, you could see, because sometimes we were like talking, helping some women in Poland, where you may not know Polish language, you know, to buy tickets. There are volunteers, but of course it's more and more people are coming, and some of you could see that some of the women, especially with kids, are rather frustrated and they don't know where to go and how everything works. And then we were taking trains through Poland, and it looked like this train to Warsaw from Polish border, like full of women and kids. And sometimes I saw how ordinary Polish citizens, they come inside train and they see that something is going on very untypical, because you see that like women and kids, and it's a bit shocking. Maybe I just will end with this, that now I and as some of my other colleagues, we are refugee or nomadic scholars, so we changed. It's very nice that people in general, people of course are very friendly, but you still you can't stay in one place for a long time, because there are some other people who are constantly coming, like some families, family of those who propose you accommodation. So you're just constantly moving, and you feel like, so I would say the status of nomadic scholar, it's very a new interesting status, and it's very good that there are a lot of now fellowships, scholarships for people like me, but the first our need is accommodation, actually, like stable permanent accommodation. And we understand that it's not so easy to get it. Maybe I would stop, and later there will be some questions or some discussions, so we could continue.
Thank you very much for your account of the first-hand experience of what it was like, what it's like for many women, for many Ukrainians who are fleeing the war. And I would invite Jessica Zakhovic to share her perspective, because she was the director of the Fulbright in Kyiv, and she also had to leave for Poland.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you so much for this honor to join this panel. I should say Tamara Martsenyuk and I are long-term colleagues. During my Fulbright year in 2017-2018 at Kyiv-Mohyla, I was able to teach in the sociology department there, where I know Tamara is based, and others on this panel I know are also Fulbright alumni. And the recent experience in the last 2 weeks has been so actually inspiring to see how our alumni have been helping each other network to safety. In addition, our Fulbright Ukrainian organization, alumni organization, Kolo, is collecting war testimonials from witnesses, firsthand witnesses across the country who have the power to write and articulate what they're seeing, experiencing. And we will also, translate these. So anybody out there who has others who are seeing things, writing them down, you can send those to our offices and we will work with you to translate them and also get some of them to The Hague. The Lemkin Center here in Warsaw is also providing translators to translate witness testimonials of war crimes, and they are working directly with The Hague. So the power of writing is needed now. I, have the benefit and the blessing of a great embassy team that asked us to evacuate from Kyiv January 27th. So I brought the 15 American Fulbright grantees here to Warsaw, so they were able to continue virtually their support and their work they were doing with their Ukrainian hosts in Ukraine. And still they are continuing, some of them, to teach actually in the institutions in Ukraine that are open, and people are studying. I think this is in testament to the fact that all through World War II, also Institute of International Education was working, and students and teachers are amazing and resilient. And that has also been demonstrated through the SUDUS program that our office supports, that's Strengthening Ukrainian Displaced University Sustainability program. These are universities, 14 of them, that were displaced from Luhansk and Donetsk regions beginning in 2015 and have persisted since that time in different locations in Ukraine, like Donetsk National University, which has been working from Vinnytsia. So these administrators have been on the avant-garde of what displacement feels like and how to survive it, and I think could be champions and leaders for others out there who are right now navigating what that is like. Yes, as Tamara mentioned, there are lots of funds now mobilizing. I know that National Academy of Sciences in Poland and also Austria has calls out for scholarships, but just getting people together into, I think, stable living situations, stable internet is, the top priority. In my own experience, my own research life, outside of my role with Fulbright, for the past 20 years, I've been writing and studying and interviewing gender and feminist activists in Ukraine. And largely being outside of, I guess, the mainstream views of social change. A lot of feminists and gender activists, I think, have been the first or the frontline responders to infringements on human rights and discrimination. And this is also, played out in my work, in my more recent discussions with artists in the creative communities and cultural platforms that have partnered with human rights and gender and feminist activists to create residencies, to create teaching objectable support connected to developing a new language for talking about gender and feminism, not only in Ukraine, but transnationally and internationally. 3 of these platforms I just wanted to highlight today that have been working directly with those affected in Donbass have been the Izolacja cultural platform, the Platforma 2 from Mariupol, and also a large kind of evolving exhibit called At the Front Line, which featured several artists from different regions of Ukraine and also from Eastern Ukraine who were writing about and making art about Donbass and about the war. These 3, cultural platforms are very closely connected to the past 8 years of displacement from Luhansk and Donetsk and have been making their primary aims to translate for Western audiences what those regions are in terms of inhabited spaces, not just a blank geopolitical canvas, which in the disinformation campaigns is how those regions are portrayed. In fact, one curatorial team from Izolacja has been working under the name DND, or There's Nothing There, as a ironic tongue-in-cheek response to the kind of invisibility that became something people in the West, I think, learned to important when we're teaching in these teach-ins. Like recently, I was at a teach-in at University of Michigan for undergrads or even grads who don't know much about Ukraine, but now are interested because they've been reading the media, is to remind them about the Maidan revolution and the war that's taken place over the past 8 years, because a lot of the fight for free, fair elections and the values that revolutionaries on the Maidan were standing for are still being fought through this war right now, that this is about standing up, defending from an invader, that more than just Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, there is a system of values that has been under threat for 8 years and prior. And this continuum of the revolution, if we think about the present moment as a revolution, not only war, but as a revolution, then I think we start to understand the global implications a little bit more, because it is about a system of rights. And I just wanted to quote briefly from the recent residency that the TU platform did during the COVID pandemic. They created this TU platform in Mariupol for artists, created a women's network called Woven Network in response to different feminist issues that the artists wanted to do. The artists that took place from Ukraine were Oksana Kazmina, Oya Fedorova from Kharkiv, and Masha Pironova from Donetsk, and Alisa Oleva from London. And there was also T.S. Beale from Scotland, Alice Maslenikova from Sweden, and a couple others also from Poland. I won't name them all here, but the Mariupol cultural scene has been thriving, and I wanted to really take a moment to mention that city because of what they're living through right now, and to pause on their work that they've done, and that they've really been on the avant-garde of culture and queer identities and feminism, that it's not a blank canvas or a gray zone of post-industrial wasteland, that this is a thriving city of culture and contemporary art and international exchange. And what is going on right now needs to stop. And I think that in addition to mobilizing education, we can also look to the women a century ago who set up the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, and start to weave together our woven network of women who have laid the groundwork for us to respond to these atrocities. So that is my spiel. I just will end with the one quote from the residency. They said, "We work in the virtual world, sharing ideas, stories, and materials, creating an inclusive, multidisciplinary, cross-European media art residency that is based in Mariupol, and most importantly, spreading women's experience in art through the story of women from the front line, which during the pandemic is now associated not only with the war taking place here, but the war taking place everywhere." So we've all had the experience of being on the front line, living through the pandemic wherever we are, and we can see now and understand now there are multiple wars that are being fought in Ukraine, and we need to act to reduce human suffering and to respond to our sisters there. So that is all for now. I look forward to our Q&A session.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your insights. And now I'll give the floor to Christina Olha Jarymowycz, who has done research on wartime volunteering in Ukraine going back to 2014.
Thank you, Olena. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. And thank you, Tamara and Jessica, for your work and for speaking on women's experiences. I think that multiple people have mentioned already that a lot of what we're seeing today is not necessarily new, right? There has been a war happening in Ukraine for the past 8 years. And I wanted to bring us back a little bit to that time, which is when I actually conducted research on women's experience as volunteers during the war in Donbass. So as a sort of introduction, I'll start with taking us back, and then I'll try and connect some of the lessons and stories from that time to what we're seeing today, and then speak a little bit about how we perhaps can aid in this situation. As I mentioned, the research I conducted was specifically on volunteerism in Ukraine during the war in Donbass. Volunteering during that war was a very visible central phenomenon. So in surveys on Ukrainian perception, actually volunteers were seen as one of the most trusted institutions in the country, even trusted more than the army and the church at that time. They were highly visible in social media, in the news, and they became really a symbol of the unity of Ukrainian people and a powerful home front that was vital to victory in the war against Russia. As I believe Jessica mentioned, a lot of what we're seeing, the sort of reaction amongst the Ukrainian population can be drawn back to the time of the war, as well as the Euromaidan, which had preceded it. So this kind of unified presentation and the sort of reactions of people in defense of their homes can also be seen as a continuation of this sense of unity that was created during this time and that was symbolized in this volunteer movement. So women really were at the forefront of this movement, really making up the majority of volunteers, according to some surveys. And they acted across different spaces. As Tamara had mentioned, a lot of times within common narratives of wartime, we see women as victims, but in these situations, it's good to and important to speak on how they are actors, central actors really in wartime spaces. So volunteerism came to be really one of the main sites of this activism, and it spread into spaces such as hospitals, centers for the displaced, as well as centers for mobilizing equipment, vehicles, and gear for the army. So in particular, women made up the majority of hospital volunteers and volunteers at centers for the refugees from Donbass. So their activities included things like mobilizing supplies, medication, but also bringing in expertise from abroad in terms of medical expertise and care for wounded in hospitals. And in refugee centers, again, mobilization of supplies, psychological support, as well as legal support in this sort of new status that came to be within Ukraine. But finally, women were also part of spaces where we don't usually see them as the main participant, which is the space of the front lines. Women actually crossed into the front lines of battle, delivering their supplies, delivering vehicles and so forth as part of volunteer groups. And this was something that actually broke some gendered barriers that had existed in the cultural perception of women's roles. So when we speak about volunteering, it's also important to talk about how women volunteers perceive their own activity. And a lot of the stories that came out of volunteer experiences included the perception of a powerful home front. So not just one that sort of protects, but one that is central to victory and that acts alongside the army. Within hospitals, women often spoke about their volunteerism as that of a traditional Ukrainian berehinya, or the protector of the home and the hearth. So there was a continuation of this understanding of women as the sort of the keepers of the home, but this was taken out of the context of the home and actually spread to different parts of society, such as centers for refugees and hospitals. And finally, there was some contestation of this understanding of women as being part of just spaces of home when they crossed into the front lines of battle, and this simply was not able to sort of align with that idea. And some women came to understand what they were doing as actually protection, or zachist, as volunteers when they stepped to the front lines of battles and actually helped to protect soldiers by delivering supplies. So when talking about this kind of feminine protection, they explained the powerful sort of nature of women alongside ideals such as women's leadership in the home, as well as the sort of natural ability of women in particular to care for their children. So they place themselves within these traditional categories or like natural categories of female powers, but by doing so, they also enabled themselves to kind of cross into the spaces where they were previously excluded or not seen as being central to. So when they crossed over to the front, they became these kind of female protectors on the front lines of battle. So this is a quote that I think kind of summarizes this idea of feminine or female protection, which is from a volunteer that was delivering supplies to the front lines and traveling regularly to support soldiers. So in the woman-child relationship, the woman is the protector. Жінка захисниця. The father cannot compete. A woman will go and do things that a man would never do. So this idea that because women can be mothers, that they actually can be even more of a protector than men as that sort of feminine ideal. So some of the results or outcomes of volunteering is the breakdown of some of those traditional gendered boundaries in the spaces of a wartime society. So it's not just about cooking borscht, but it's also about going and fighting or protecting the protectors. Volunteering really gave women an important and vital sense of self within the war effort. They gained expertise, logistics, in logistics, supplying the military as well as military tactics, and they became vocal advocates for the army, veterans, and refugees. And they were a part of the process of strengthening the army and legal protections for refugees, which is some of what we're seeing today. So I wanted to connect a little bit the experience of women during the war in Donbass, what we're seeing today. Obviously a very different context, a full-scale war where the army and the leadership are at the center of events. It's a more trusted army, a stronger army. Leadership is also, from what I see, seen as more trustworthy at this time, at least. Yet, I think that volunteering and the Ukrainian people are actually still central to this conflict because of how it's being fought, and because of the needs that are coming out of it, and how these networks have actually continued to exist. So, first of all, the sort of strength and unity of the Ukrainian people is important as a counter to the Russian colonialist narrative, a sort of obvious rejection of that idea of a fraternal unity and longing for being saved. Secondly, the focus of Russian attacks are on cities and civilians. So as a result, volunteers, everyday people are becoming main actors in this war. They are having to organize themselves. And women are an essential part of this. Also, because of humanitarian crises that are happening and the breakdown of services, so volunteers will have to step in and are stepping in to sort of fill in those breaks in services. As Tamara actually mentioned, because I myself have luckily not experienced this, people are helping each other. People have to under these circumstances. And finally, the funds that are being sent over continue to be going to volunteer organizations that were formed during the Donbass war, and have activated again on social media platforms. So within this context as well, I think that we're seeing some of that incorporation of women into this idea of protection today as well. So it's common now to not just thank protectors in the masculine sense, so as захисники, but also захисниці. So it's not simply, it's not simply seen as a masculine duty, but one that incorporates women as parts of the armed forces, but also as key players in society that are helping to protect the country. So in some cases, from what I've seen, it's not simply the thank you to protectors of both genders is not simply a thank you to the army, but it's also a thank you to volunteers and to the Ukrainian people that are seen as central to the defense of the country. One of the things that I wanted to bring up is that when we speak about women's experiences, it's also important to kind of see differences that can be experienced amongst women along categories such as age, class, and life stage. So we heard from Tamara earlier about age really being an important sort of factor in vulnerability, of course, but also it's an important factor in who is able to leave, who is kind of seen as having to stay for other reasons. For instance, a lot of the refugees that we're seeing are, of course, women and children because of the order to not allow men ages 18 to 60 to leave. So women with children, of course, are now becoming sole caregivers to children outside of their own country, right? But also women tend to be caregivers of elderly parents as well. So if we have elderly parents that are unable or unwilling to leave, they're also oftentimes having to stay to continue to be with them. So from the interviews that I conducted, some of the volunteers that were younger as well have now joined the army. So that's another sort of division that occurs alongside age in women's experiences. And finally, financial resources, of course, who is able to leave, who has the means to leave, in terms of vehicles, in terms of resources, in terms of connections abroad, is also an important dividing line alongside women's experiences. So what can be done? So if I'm speaking from the perspective of somebody who is living in the United States and there's peace outside the door, and there's still a lot of people who really don't understand what's happening. So we're not in Europe. We don't see refugees on our streets. The sun is shining and the pandemic is ending. Not a lot of people want to be sort of experiencing this feeling of instability at this time. So I think that from my perspective, it's just really important to be visible, to talk to people, to have conversations, because people still really don't understand what's happening. They don't know why there's a war. And it's kind of shocking to hear because of the gravity of this situation. But person-to-person conversations matter, visibility matters, posting sort of links to donations, talking to friends, talking to neighbors matters. So I think that that's one kind of small everyday step that can be done. I also think that in societies such as the US, creating alliances is important. So it's not simply connecting Ukrainians to Ukrainians, but it's connecting the experience of Ukrainians to other societies under war so that more people can sort of understand the connections between these events. And finally, of course, donating, but also reaching out to groups to provide expertise. So donations don't necessarily have to be monetary, but connecting with Ukrainian groups to understand what they need in terms of expertise, in terms of connections, I think is something that we can do. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for providing us with an overview of and placing it in the context of prior women's volunteering. And Dr. Olga Boichak has also done a lot of research on civil society and volunteering in Ukraine, so she will be next.
Thank you so much, Olena. It is a great pleasure for me to be here, and I have great admiration for the work of my fellow co-panelists, so it is a great honor. If I may, let me just share my slides. Simply for the reason that the stuff that I'm going to talk about has a lot of visuality in it, and so I hope that that is all right. Okay, so a little bit of a background on my work. I'm a media sociologist, and I've been studying, just like many of you, the Russian-Ukrainian war since its inception in 2014. I've been mostly looking at the role that digital media play in affording remote participation in wars. So I've done field work with volunteers, and I've also looked at transnational activism by diasporas with regard to this war, and looked at identity construction at the backdrop of war. I've done part of my field work in Mariupol, and so what is happening there today is really really terrible, and I have no words to describe it. I also would like to share my frustration at the inability to highlight the contribution of women in English language scholarship, because writing about Mariupol, a lot of the activism that was happening and is happening there was done by women. And so it is really difficult in the English language to highlight those contributions when the names have to be anonymized. And so I'm particularly grateful to Olena for bringing us together here surrounding the role of women in resisting occupation. So after the first night of Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine, a few of my friends have been sharing those images on social media, and you probably all recognize this object. One of my friends, who's a mother of four, after a sleepless night spent at the bomb shelter, she took her kids and they went to a public library where they were cutting scraps of camouflage and weaving them into a network. And so then in the course of the following weeks, I saw numerous posts by friends, most of whom were women, about making those camouflage nets. And of course, some of them had joked that it was a productive way to handle stress by keeping their hands busy with crafts. But the artifact that they are crafting happens to be an integral element of Ukraine's defense against the invasion. And so it has become, in a way, an aesthetic of Ukraine's resistance to Russia's occupation that has been ongoing for the past 8 years. And so this idea of productive resistance, as in resistance to, not resistance from, kind of like we can think of the notions of positive and negative freedom. Nancy Edlinger sees resistance as a productive act rather than one of avoidance and or obfuscation. And in this context, crises emerge as possibilities for constructing spaces for this productive resistance. And this is where people can use affordances of their physical and digital environment to resist hegemonic power. And so thinking about the role that women play in this productive resistance, we can trace the social life of artifacts that are being crafted at the backdrop of humanitarian crisis. And we can think, what do camouflage networks conceal and what do they reveal in the process of their making? So historically, camouflage netting has been predominantly studied in the context of its effectiveness by the military. And so they're used to mask objects of strategic and cultural significance. However, we know very little about the social life and the cultural histories, especially at the manufacturing stage. And this is a haunting World War II era photograph by Dorothy Olena that shows the US Department of Defense relying on forced migrant labor by women of Japanese heritage who were hand making those nets, because it's actually really difficult to automate this process of camouflage netting making, which which was one of the reasons why so many women in Ukraine started joined this initiative. And so these are really complicated histories of this military objects, and they speak to the role of camouflage, not only in concealing the army positions from being seen by the enemy, but also obfuscating military's reliance on contributions by women, as well as precarious workers more generally for the production of camouflage nets. So I was wondering, is it always the case that the production of camouflage netting is a militarizing maneuver that ruins social solidarities among those who craft it? Does it have to be? And so I've been looking at a network of grassroots collectives that are known as the Spiders, Babuchki, who call themselves that. And this is a very eclectic, heterogeneous collective that consists of hundreds of network-making communities all over Ukraine. It got started in 2014 by a woman who was based in Kyiv and who was really discouraged by the scarcity and the price of those camouflage nets. As we know, back in 2014, Ukraine's army was in a dire need of many things, and camouflage nets were one of them. And so this woman had developed a technique to craft these military-grade nets from discarded military textiles. And she recorded a video where she instructed and encouraged others to do the same. And so that video had sparked a transnational movement. And for the past 8 years, over 500 collectives have, and these are not just collectives based in Ukraine, there are groups all over Western Europe that have been crafting these camouflage nets. And so what we're seeing today, following the invasion, is really a continuation of the initiatives that have existed for many years. The majority of these organizations are founded and led by women. However, there are a lot of men involved at different stages in the process. There are some men-led initiatives as well. And the important thing here is that many of the participants come from all kinds of precarious backgrounds. So some are retired, some are living with a life-limiting condition, some are lonely and looking for community, some are not able to contribute financially, and so they join these initiatives to be able to somehow contribute to the defense effort, and some are young children working alongside their parents. And so while camouflage networks are these collectively crafted military artifacts, camouflage scraps have also their social life. Some of them are sourced from discarded Ukrainian army uniforms or from humanitarian donations by Ukraine's strategic partners, old tactical gear, as well as surprisingly Soviet-era bed linens. That's for the winter masking networks. So this is a commonplace household item that had once signified prosperity that is now being cut and layered on a new plane of representation. And this is just one of the quotes that through which the spiders describe themselves. They say, "What can unite book enthusiasts, senior citizens, teachers, HR specialists, priests, librarians, accountants, and entrepreneurs, physicists, and humanitarians? Something that can be bought but is not for sale, something that requires a lot of attention and patience, used to divert unwanted attention, something that is made from scratch and from scraps but is priceless. The nets, camouflage nets, those save lives," end quote. So on the surface, it may seem as though by engaging in craftivist practices, spiders reinforce traditional representations of masculinity, the so-called frontline warriors, and femininity, the defenders of the home front. And I believe Christina has written extensively about it, so I will not talk about it too much. But I think that, and I'm happy to discuss this, that while the spiders' craftivist practices still rely on feminized labor that is invisible, labor that is in a way undervalued, they're also militant in their solidarity. And in weaving their literal and metaphorical networks, they found a way to organize outside of the traditional institutions and identities while making themselves highly visible in the public spaces. And so by making the land and the soldiers invisible at a macroscopic scale by concealing them, these collectively crafted camouflage networks also bridge and contest divisions among traditionally marginalized identities, such as women, such as the elderly, people with disabilities, people living in poverty, internally displaced persons, and others. And also what these collectives do is they foreground these communities' visibilities in public spaces, which is something Jessica has written about in her excellent book. And they're making them connected to others through their resistance against Russian hegemonic militarization. And so this is something that Tamara was talking about, victims versus agents. This is, in my opinion, a distinct case where women are being agents by crafting these camouflage networks. And so thinking of what is getting crafted in the process of making camouflage netting, first of all, there are emerging forms of sociality that are hiding in plain sight through the manufacturing of those networks. And they are an integral part of the military-industrial complex, but they do much more than render the soldier bodies invisible from above. And when seen from below, they bring to the fore these emerging forms of sociality and resistance. And also by cutting and layering those scraps of the military-industrial complex onto a new plane of representation, spiders do make a decolonial cut from Ukraine's Soviet past. And so as we go about our daily lives, we encounter and sometimes repurpose fragments of the geopolitical to craft new solidarities and imaginaries of the future. And spiders do not simply produce artifacts, they also articulate an epistemology of survival, creating material and symbolic links between the public and private, between civil and military, and between everyday and geopolitical. And as hegemonic imperialist discourses will likely continue to camouflage the lived experiences of military violence in wars, we can also see this militarizing aesthetic crafted by women that can become a symbol of productive resistance to Russia's occupation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Olga, for highlighting the role and the importance of these women who are making the camouflage nets and building networks. I just posted in the chat a list of a few organizations: the Ukrainian National Women's League of America, the Ukraine Crisis Appeal, and the Institute of International Education's Emergency Student Fund. These are the organizations that our panelists have identified as institutions that provide some support for different groups within Ukraine. So if you have funds or interested, you might explore the work and learn more about the work that they're doing and contribute to their efforts. Now I would like to open the floor for discussion, and you can post your questions and the Q&A chat, and they will be visible for the panelists, and they will try to answer them. I don't see any questions right now, so I don't know if panelists want to make some comments, in response to each other's suggestion, comments, or remarks. Okay, we have the first. Just go ahead.
Sure. I have a question, maybe for Tamara Martsenyuk, who has done such a beautiful job speaking through an autoethnography. Tamara, are there, kind of pop-up teaching opportunities happening in Ukraine right now? What support could be viably delivered to Ukrainian universities? I know that there's a lot of discussion about placing Ukrainian students abroad into European and North American universities, but maybe in your experience, if you're willing to share any ideas with us about how to support Ukrainian universities in Ukraine at this time, I think it could really help us out.
Jessica, thanks a lot. It's really a very important topic because a lot of scholars and also like students, they can't come abroad. And for all these scholarships and fellowships that different countries and universities propose, you're supposed to come like on campus. And now, as I know, in some universities, for example, in Cherkasy, they already reopened online teaching. At our Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, we plan to do it maybe from April 1, the 1st of April. So still, for example, for me, I've got propositions to come to teach to some universities, but as far as I still hope that victory will be quite soon, and I don't want to lose connection with my home university, or to combine, we teach quite a lot, and now with the situation of this war, it will be even harder, because there were more peculiarities in this teaching, like not all students could join, whatever. So it's quite tricky for those who professors who are employed at universities to actually to get this fellowships and to get some extra money while they are in Ukraine. Another issue that, for example, it's very, when you experience these events, it's very difficult immediately to write some papers to talk on this. So we need some time. And we were thinking, for example, with my colleagues, that it would be great to get financial support like now for scholars, but they may write their papers, research, maybe like in summer or autumn or like later. Because even I remember from my Euromaidan experience, I managed to return to topic only half a year after events, and to reflect and to write in a more academic way. So I would say that it would be nice to have like so-called support for research now, but results not immediately, a bit later. And it would be, in general, it would be important also if students, I don't know, I don't have statistics, but probably there are some also displaced refugee students on different campuses. And it would be nice to have that they would have also connection with their university and with Ukraine. Later, not to stay like for longer or forever in Europe or in other countries. So it's quite a tricky issue how to make the universities in Ukraine alive, because even before war there was so-called a bit crisis of higher education. The gap between demand from the society and current status. And now when I follow for example, some discussions what to do with universities, now we have a lot of universities. So how maybe to change some, to put efforts and stress on some particular disciplines and to come down with some other disciplines. So it's a nation discussion because still, we were a couple of weeks before war, we were protesting against our Minister of Education and Science, and we still have a problem with, plagiarism, corruption, sexual harassment, and a number of other issues in universities. And because of pandemic, somehow these problems, they were postponed. But it's another huge challenge what to do and how to change this system, like to make universities more autonomous, or to make more cooperation with international universities. So but still it's important for university community to be to have some connection with Ukraine. Yes, and so not to get lost somewhere abroad.
And it seems also a gender issue because men ages 18 to 60 right now are not applying for fellowships abroad. So it's important to have opportunities also for them in Ukraine if they are applying right now.
Absolutely. I see, for example, how some male scholars are also very upset when they need to evacuate, for example, from Kharkiv. And some for men in this situation, it's even more emotionally, like if they are not ready to fight, to be in combat, but they want to do something else. So it's they can't, so they stay in the western part of Ukraine. They can't come abroad like me. And some of my friends, so no, I understand that they see that I'm privileged in a way that that I could escape abroad, and it's also absolutely it's a nation challenge for male academics to to stay with academia and to work to earn living, to earn a living, and what to do in this case. So you are absolutely right. It's a problem, and there are some even I also work with issues of masculinity and men studies, and we have there are some initiatives. I would say that this obligatory draft for men, it's a discrimination against men. And we see how there were cases where men trying to escape and they were bribing at the border, or it was one case, I think in recent days, they were changing clothes to female to escape, but then caught, and of course it was heavily discussed, like why are they doing this, and even taking evacuation train. I could see how, for example, next to me that was a group of 4 men, and they were feeling not very comfortable because they're in evacuation train, but they were explaining that they came from Rivne to Kyiv to go to territorial self-defense, and they were told that go back to your home city because we have enough people and we don't have extra, ammunition and extra weapon for you. So actually they returned, and they were a bit, you could see that they were not very comfortable to be in this train together with women.
Yeah, thank you, Tamara. We have just one more question for you, and then the second question will be, I think, addressed to all the panelists. So the question for Tamara is about the range of roles that women are currently playing in the Ukrainian armed forces. If you can elaborate upon it based upon the research you've done.
Thanks a lot. Actually, we after Euromaidan protests in 2013-14, where some women publicly declared that they want to conduct traditional male gender roles, so to be in self-defense units, and they did it. And later they went as volunteers to war in Donbass. There were debates and actually grassroots initiatives to change legislation and to allow women to take combat positions, because actually as you could see, the history of post-Soviet army that lost its prestige. Women were in armed forces, but they were taking this more so-called traditional male roles, like carrying different service positions, but not combat positions. And this research initiative was called Invisible Battalion. It was like a liberal feminist initiative driven by military women to change the situation. And the list of these combat positions, it was changed, and women managed to take more combat positions, but of course not all. And recently there were some changes in military education, and actually, like very soon, almost I think almost all combat positions will be open. Another issue is, so we call about horizontal gender segregation, but as for vertical, that usually women not hold like top positions, and for them it's very difficult to do military career. But it's also changed because of women's experience in Donbass war, and actually there were just in general the fact that women want changes in armed forces. These changes, I would say, improve situation also for men, because these problems, at suicides in armed forces, bullying, sexual harassment, it's a problems typical for not only, of course, for women, but also for men. And there were a number of reforms to change this. And now, as we could see, there are quite active female veterans in Ukraine. There is 500,000 of veterans of a so-called anti-terrorist operation or Donbass war, and women are very visible as a group who have their organizations. They also do a lot of, I would say, international lobbying and going abroad and talking about the war in Donbass. And now those women veterans, they also participate in this war on different combat positions. So situation is changing. Of course, there are different perceptions. Some feminists would say that it's militarization of society, and this initiative was also criticized from some point, but I think now you see that with appealing to peace, as usually expected from women, yes, that women appealing to peace, to so it's not an issue anymore. And it's quite debatable if it's possible to do now.
Okay, thank you. We just have 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to answer a question that was posed by Andita, who wants us to reflect a little bit on the implications, long-term implications of women activism on their participation in politics when the war is over. Christina?
Yeah, I can speak really quickly on that, just some thoughts. So I think that it's a bit of a, I guess, catch-22, right? Like Tamara was mentioning, in a sense, women perhaps have a privilege of leaving, but men have the privilege of being seen as some of the primary actors in a war, right? As soldiers. And I think we've seen often that after wars, these sort of positions as heroes or protectors can drive them to sort of important political positions. And at least from my experience, women's volunteerism during the Donbass War had this sort of expectation of selflessness, right? So as volunteers, this idea of protection is more about not doing it for your own gain. So the women that are volunteers had this kind of difficulty of crossing over into politics because it was seen as a space of potential corruption, a space of that's oftentimes linked with gain, right? So it's sometimes difficult to translate these more feminine or female-dominated positions into positions of power for that reason. And it's easier to do so for perhaps men who serve as soldiers, who are seen as sort of the more traditional leadership within times of war. So there's that danger that even though women are playing an important role in the current war, it's difficult to translate it into a sort of, after the war is over, a position of political power. But that being said, we did see in parliamentary elections in 2019, an increase in women's representation almost doubled, actually. And that was in the aftermath of or not the aftermath, but in the process of a conflict. So perhaps women are able to sort of translate their roles into greater political representation. But yeah, that's to be seen.
Thank you. Olga, would you like to add? And I also wanted to mention that, you know, right now it's 5 a.m. in Sydney. So Olga is, you know, braving the early morning hours.
Thanks, Olena. Yeah, in Australia we get used to this because that is the only way how we can attend international events. So building up on what Christina has already said, I've been grappling with this question: how is volunteering political? In my work, and of course there are some volunteers that definitely do run for office, and we've seen this happen. It is they do describe it as a leadership school, and they do exercise a lot of political leadership. They get into the positions of power. It is a bit of a contentious issue among other volunteers because some of them do explicitly see their work as non-political, as kind of more on the civil society side. But that is just talking about the capital K politics. So we can see so many ways in which volunteering and these women-led initiatives are the kind of lowercase p political. And there are two main aspects that I see in which they manifest. So first is care as political. So essentially by choosing to provide care to certain populations, we encourage their survival, right? We contribute to their survival, and that is an explicit way through which a lot of this activism is political. And then the second one is through narratives. So a lot of the narratives that are being constructed by volunteers, they are these new civic vocabularies that are essentially onto-political. So they are, a lot of volunteers are articulating their relationship to the state. They are articulating the relationship between the citizens or among the citizens within a state. And so a lot of the times that does represent a step away from the so-called, the more the Soviet relic, where the state was this kind of a facade, a bureaucratic facade behind which there was nothing. And so right now I'm really excited to see those notions and those narratives of active citizenship that emerge and that are driven and that are perpetuated by volunteers. And that is, I guess, my main interest in seeing how these narratives can be explicitly political and can help articulate what Ukraine is, what contemporary Ukraine is in the wartime. Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica, would you like to add something, drawing on your research on women after the Euromaidan?
Sure, yes. I was just going to add into the chat another resource for a model that can be very useful for other EU countries and also North America. The National Academy of Sciences of Poland has been, restarting a lot of longstanding relationships with the Ukrainian National Academy of Sciences and also new scholarships. So I'll put that in the chat in a minute. But on research before and since Euromaidan, I think a lot of the discussion, at least in the gender and feminist community, has been about the anti-discrimination law, which was one of the negotiating chips between the EU and Yanukovych. And actually the EU allowed Yanukovych to strike the anti-discrimination law from the agreement, which he didn't sign in the end, obviously. But that was revisited in 2018 and passed in Ukraine. So there is a set of anti-discrimination laws and also a national human rights strategy, which was announced last year. All the pieces have been put in place, I think, for Ukraine to be on the track to EU membership. And I think a lot of the campaigning that we see in, at least where I am right now in Poland, there's a Ukrainian flag on every bus, every street corner, every metro. Huge campaign here for Ukraine. And I think it's not only targeted or about refugees, it's more broadly about Ukraine joining the EU. And that is, I think, something that should not be lost in that path is the importance of the human rights strategy and holding accountable Ukraine's future leaders to emerge from this violence. To also hold accountable lustration trials. There were no, in the period between Maidan and, the present outbreak of the war that's been ongoing, there were no lustration trials of Berkut officers, save for one that happened this past fall. I know that there's been a lot of struggle around reforms in the courts and other things, possibly the sanctions on Russia and the strangling of funding from Russia reaching Ukraine's MPs could be very helpful in Ukraine's future march to the EU. And also if Ukraine successfully manages to kind of navigate between these, on the one hand, influences from Russia, but also on the other hand, problems in the EU. I think that this will be an opportunity for others to reinvent the values of democracy that Ukraine has been fighting for and fighting for successfully. That is, unfortunately, right now on the backs of the Ukrainian citizens who are suffering this humanitarian crisis. And the human rights strategy is one that the EU will, I hope, in The Hague, hold everyone accountable to, and the West being involved as well in some of this. I have my own criticisms as a US citizen of decisions that have been made by our country in moving forward, and I can only focus on what I can do and advocate for in my country. And I encourage others to take a stand on the right side of history and do not allow shuffling of feet around whether or not to engage Putin and his regime. And meanwhile, recognizing citizens are not the same as their government. And many, citizens of Belarus and Russia have been standing up. I hope more of them will. I hope more soldiers will defect from the Russian army. I hope there will be a belief in democracy and a light at the end of the tunnel for those citizens who are fighting the good fight on Ukraine's side of history, which is the side that I have always believed in. So that's my message.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for all the panelists and for the audience. And just before we conclude, I want to mention that the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the United States will hold another event, a webinar on energy policy, in which Margarita Balmaceda will present on March 19 on Saturday. So you can check out the website and learn more the details. So thank you very much for all the participants. And please consider donating to one of the organizations so that they have identified. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.